I grew up with parents that approached life with a sense of courage. They came from the wrong side of the tracks, but they realised that the value in the future was what they built in the present. So sometimes we put so much emphasis on what's going forward that we forget about who we are right now. So my dad, he was an Australian champion, tennis player. From the age of about 22 to the late 70s, my dad died at 86, but my dad played tennis. Now, you can imagine growing up in a family like that. What do you do when you've got a father that's a professional tennis player? You play tennis. But you didn't just play tennis on the tennis courts. You played tennis everywhere. We walked down the street, and our job was to bounce the ball on this part of the racket. So, of course, the balls are going everywhere. But that was the task. We always knew that we were going to get that much control, we'd be able to bounce it like that. And then we'd get it on the back wall. My dad built a lovely concrete back wall just so that we could practice our shots. Well, I don't think he really built it for us. My dad was always on the wall. And I used to think, age 70, my dad's out on the wall practicing his topspin. I'm thinking, Dad, don't you think you got it by now? He said, no. He said, remember, I grew up, Lisa, with flat shots. He said, so all the time I'm tweaking. I'm always tweaking. What can I add? And then when he was 75, he started to practice drop shots. He says, because they're all getting older. And I looked at my dad, I went, you're old. He said, yeah, but some of them are older than me. He said, and I think young. So my dad was always on a soapbox about the way you practice. He said, if you're going to get brave, you've got to do the brave things in the private moments, which is a little bit like the book of character. The brave things in the private moments. Because, we're talking about predicting the future with robots. But have you thought about the fact that we can predict whether your relationship's going to last the next 5 years? Have you read those books? How many of you got into a relationship on purpose so that it would only last a short time? Anybody? Yeah, a few. But most of us go in for the long term. And the question is, then did you actually learn how to have one long term? Do you know John Gottman, the research on relationships shows that 90% accurate. If they watch your little tiny actions every single day, and they film people in relationships, they watch you in action, they can predict whether your relationship's going to make the next 5 years. Now, how many of you want to know what are those important things that are going to go the next 5 years? Of course, we want to know how to make things last. And one of the basics is, when you're in trouble, lean in. Lean towards your partner. Because most of the time when we're in trouble, what do? We go, we try and get away from them. All the time. Every little thing, think about where you lean in. Now think about that in business. As a leader, where do you lean into people? Do you know that if we just change this part of our conversation, that in all circumstances, make your conversation 50% questions? Most of us are really good at telling people stuff. But 50% questions. How many of you know that you'd have to think a lot to do that, please, besides me? Yeah. But even if we improved 5%, 10%, and started to ask more questions, then we're more likely to have people that feel like they are valued, feel like they are acknowledged, and people start to feel like they belong when you start to ask questions and listen. And so we've got to watch that. Are we practicing the things that actually build brave cultures? Let me give you the 4 main times when a culture is decided in a company. Opportunity number 1 is when you've got a new idea. You've been to a meeting, you've got a new idea, but the way they respond to your new idea determines culture. Number 2, when you actually ask for help. Like you're on overload, you need a little bit of extra to get the report done, and you raise in the meeting, I actually need a little help. The response to that determines, is this a culture where you can be trusted to ask for help? Third opportunity. Well, you're in a meeting and they suggest something, or they say, this is what we're doing and we're going to go ahead with it, and you start to push back and go, wait a minute, I don't know that we've thought this through. I think there could be a better way. Just to see what happens when you push back. And the fourth big determiner in culture in a company is when you ask for a personal favour. For example, I desperately need Friday morning off. I know it's a big company meeting, but my son is, got an event that I just don't want to miss. Just these little things. 4 little places where the culture is determined and where you need courage. But as Brene Brown would say, it's going to require vulnerability to have the courage to either push back, to ask for help, to ask for a favour, or to put a new idea forward. What about in your relationship? How many of you are in a relationship, please? Just give me a wave. Gee, they're still popular, aren't they? Do you know, relationships are still the generator of nearly all success. Do you know the security of what's happening in your world, in your home, can actually empower you to take new ideas and new courage into the workplace? But how you talk to one another right there in that personal space. Just like my dad's practicing on the brick wall, what are you practicing with one another? It's a little bit like the way I've written books. I mean, I don't know how many of you know I've written 7 best-selling books. But unfortunately, I've written 10 books. 3 complete duds. It's a shame, isn't it? But see, what I had to learn was that you often have to do something poorly before you do it well. And you have to persevere through the discomfort of poor performance before you'll ever do anything well. So courage is actually failing gracefully and not pretending, oh, I've just got bestsellers. No, I've got disasters as well. I've got a few in my home life as well. Don't look at my children. You know what I love about children? Children reveal all your weaknesses publicly. And I love the fact that my children, like me, are willing to do things where we are prepared to do poorly before we do well. Like my young daughter, she's currently in Amsterdam. She was trying to get a job in The Hague in the human rights area. But what she discovered when she got there was they really weren't interested in her because she didn't have 5 languages. Well, more importantly, she didn't have Dutch. And so she just set her mind, say, all right, if I do nothing else, I just need to learn the language. And she said, Mum, it's been really hard just hanging out in a foreign country, learning the language in the hope that I'm going to get a job. And I'm just proud to announce that she did a full interview in Dutch 2 weeks ago and got herself her first job. Like, it's amazing, but you've got to do it poorly before you do it well. And one of the reasons, right, I write books that are so different to all my colleagues is that I just like to read a little bit. I'm into small amounts of information, so if you need inspiration, you just pick a pink page, and if you need to calm down, you pick a purple page, and if you've lost your sense of humour, you pick a yellow page, and if you need help with your relationships, you pick a blue page. I mean, how many of you like to read like this? Yeah, because it's drip feeding, and to have the courage to drip feed, it's like, what are the little things we need to do right now in our world? Brene Brown says, choose courage over comfort. But I say to myself, Lisa, choose 20 seconds of embarrassing courage. Just 20 seconds. Sometimes it's making a phone call. Sometimes it's just walking up to people and saying, hello, I'm Lisa, nice to meet you. I mean, my colleagues and I, we spend our lives in conferences. But we still have to make the choice every day to walk up and say, hello, nice to meet you. Hello, why are you here today? What are you hoping to get out of it? Day in, day out, to keep the joy in the basics that make connection work. I mean, conferences are about connecting. It's not just about knowledge, as Phil beautifully explained. I don't know if you realise it, but knowledge is like underwear. It's useful, but you don't want to show it off. It's one of those things that's just the quiet building block that's happening in our world. Do you understand? It's really important to know when you're brave, because you can transfer the feeling of being brave in those places into other parts of your world. So we need to remember where we're already showing courage, and that will help us to take the courage. And I want to just close off my little piece with a story that took some courage from me. I was born with my left eye permanently closed, and I was called names my whole life, and it was incredibly cruel. But it taught me something. It taught me that the most important words I would ever hear were not the words I'd hear from other people, but the words I would hear from myself to myself. They were the most important words. And that I would become whatever I said about me. And it was really interesting because when I was 17, a young man who was at a party where I was came up to me at the end of the night and he said to me, I just wanted to introduce myself to you. I've noticed that you've been winking at me all night. That was a turning point for me because I realised there's more to me than meets the eye. But that was just a little bit of preparation for what was going to come decades down the road. I was married 8 years. I'd had 2 babies to my husband, and my husband received a letter from the United States saying, Dear Colin, you have a daughter and she's turning 16. And I'd like you to acknowledge her. Well, it took him 72 hours to show me the letter. I thought that was brave because he could have burnt it. He could have hidden it. He could have pretended he never got it. But 72 hours later, he brought it to me and said, look. At first, I wanted to kill him. And then I went, all right, we had to get over. It wasn't about us. It was actually about a little girl on the other side of the world that wanted to know, was my husband her daddy? So we got on a plane and we went to Florida to meet this beautiful young woman, 16 years of age, with blonde curly hair and braces. She looked a bit like me, really. And we had a very tearful 4 hours the first night. But at the end of the night, she just looked at my husband and she said, do you know, I was going to come and find you. When I turned 18, I was going to come and find you. I was going to come to Australia. She said, but I never dreamed or even hoped that my daddy would come looking for me. And of course, we all burst into tears. And we discovered that the little choices that we'd made for the last 8 years in our marriage had prepared us. That marriage and family wasn't exclusive, that it could be inclusive, there could be room for more, that we could bring more people into our world. And that gorgeous young woman moved in and out of our lives. Every 3 months a year we'd bring her out while she was studying. And eventually at 24 she moved here. And she married the boy down the street. She's given me 2 grandchildren. Now her mother named her Christian Victoria. Christian because she said she was a gift from God. She thought she could never have children. And Victoria because that's where her father lived. Imagine if he'd lived in New South Wales. So what we discovered, that what we could have pushed away, what we could have ignored, what looked too hard, took a lot of courage, ended up being one of our finest gifts, one of our best legacies. And you know what? She's been the most incredible role model for our 2 younger children. And sometimes the only thing to have is courage. Thank you very much.